Young nurse covered a sleeping man with her jacket at the hospital. The Millionaire CEO woke up and changed her life forever. The corridor outside the ICU was cloaked in cold fluorescent light, the kind that made everything feel a little more sterile, a little more distant. The ticking of the wall clock was the only real sound, echoing through the otherwise still hallway, interrupted now and then by the soft hum of machines behind heavy doors. Daniel Wexler sat alone on a narrow bench, his elbows resting on his knees, his face buried in his hands. His suit, elegant and expensive, was wrinkled and slightly askew, as though it had not been taken off for days. His hair was unkempt, his tie loosened and twisted. To a passerby, he might have looked like a man taking a nap in a quiet corner. But up close, he looked like a man barely holding himself together. Grace Reynolds, a young nurse finishing her rounds, spotted him as she turned the corner. She had worked enough night shifts to recognize the quiet despair that clung to certain people sitting in that hallway. But something about this man, his stillness, his silence, made her pause. He was the picture of power brought low, the kind of broken that money could not mend. She hesitated for a moment, then slowly reached into her bag and pulled out a light jacket, the one she always kept for long, cold nights. With careful steps she approached, her movements slow and gentle. She meant only to drape the jacket over his shoulders, to offer a small kindness without words. Just as her fingers touched the fabric of his suit, Daniel stirred. He flinched and looked up, startled. Their eyes met, his red and glassy, rimmed with fatigue and emotion. Grace's breath caught at the sight. He looked like a man unraveling at the seams. "Did you just cry?" she asked softly. It was a simple question, but it cracked something open. Daniel didn't respond right away. A tear slid down his cheek, followed by another. His breath shuddered, and then, without warning, he wept. His head dropped, his shoulders shook, and he wept. Drudge then, the kind of crying that comes from years of silence, of holding everything in. Grace didn't speak. She didn't move. She just stood there, still, calm, and quietly present, as he let it all fall. Daniel sat in silence for a long time after the crying subsided. His breathing had steadied, but his shoulders remained heavy, as if the weight of grief and guilt had seeped deep into his bones. Grace hadn't moved. She remained nearby, not pressing, not prying, just present. The soft hum of the hospital continued around them, indifferent and ceaseless. He finally spoke, his voice hoarse and low, as though each word scraped its way out of him. "Alice, my daughter, she's in there," he said, his eyes flicking toward the ICU doors. "She's 3, just 3, and she's unconscious. They're still running tests. No one can tell me if she's going to be okay." Grace turned slightly toward him, her hands resting gently on her lap. She said nothing, but her eyes locked on his with quiet intensity. Daniel took a slow breath, then another. His hands trembled slightly. "I wasn't home," he continued, almost in a whisper. "She woke up in the middle of the night and went looking for me, climbed the stairs by herself. I wasn't there to stop her." His voice cracked. He swallowed hard and shook his head. "I was still at the office. Another late meeting. Another last-minute email. Another excuse." Grace's heart clenched, but she remained still, letting his words carry their own weight. "She just wanted me to read her a bedtime story," he said, bitterness rising in his throat. "That's it, that's simple. And I wasn't there." He leaned forward, burying his face in his hands again, though the tears had stopped. Now there was just rawness. "I gave her everything, nannies, toys, the best clothes, a private preschool, everything money can buy," he said, his voice hardening. "But not me. I thought if I just worked harder, made more, she'd be okay." He let out a hollow laugh that died in the air. "My wife, her mom, Melissa, she passed away 2 years ago," he said. "A sudden stroke. One moment we were making dinner, the next she was gone. Just like that." Grace's eyes softened even more, but she still did not interrupt. "I tried to hold it together for Alice," he went on. "I threw myself into the company, into rebuilding everything. I thought if I could just keep it all together, keep us afloat, she'd never have to know what it's like to be without." He stared at the floor. "But she does know. She knows better than anyone. I wasn't really there, not the way a father should be." The silence returned, heavy and aching. Daniel looked up, blinking slowly. "If something happens to her," he whispered, "if she doesn't wake up, I won't be able to forgive myself. Not ever." His voice broke again on the last word. Grace, still quiet, reached out and placed her hand lightly on his shoulder. Her touch was warm, grounding, not rushed or performative, just real, human. She didn't say, "It's not your fault." She didn't tell him to stop blaming himself or remind him that he meant well. She knew those words would only fall flat. Instead, she gave him her silence, her presence, and her calm. Then, after a moment, her voice came, soft but firm. "She's in good hands," she said. "The doctors here are some of the best, and your little girl, she's strong." Daniel nodded slightly, his throat too tight to respond. Grace let her hand rest just a second longer, then slowly drew it back. "And you're here now," she added, her eyes meeting his. "That's what matters." He looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time since their encounter. There was no judgment in her gaze, just steady warmth, and something else he hadn't felt in a long time: trust. "You need to rest, Mr. Wexler," she said gently. "Alice will need you when she wakes up." "And she will." Daniel let out a shaky breath, part exhaustion, part tentative relief. "Thank you," he whispered. Grace gave him a small nod, her blonde hair catching the light as she stood. "I'll check in on her again soon," she said, her voice barely above the quiet hum of the corridor. And with that, she turned and walked down the hallway, leaving Daniel alone, but a little less broken than before. Grace Reynolds had grown used to exhaustion, not the kind sleep could fix, but the weight of quiet responsibility, carried day after day without complaint. On paper, she was a full-time nurse at one of the busiest hospitals in the city. But beyond the scrubs and long shifts, she was a daughter, a sister, and the steady heart of a small, struggling family. Every morning at 7:00 IMM, Grace clocked out after her night shift and walked home through quiet streets. Their apartment was tucked in a modest neighborhood, the kind filled with cracked sidewalks, faded paint, and kids playing tag in the afternoons. By the time she arrived, her mother would be awake, seated at the kitchen table, a heating pad wrapped around her knees. Years of rheumatoid arthritis had slowed her down, but not her spirit. Grace would greet her with a tired smile, then head straight to the stove. Breakfast was simple: leftover rice, oatmeal, or toast if they had enough. Lily, her 10-year-old sister, would wander in, sleepy-eyed, hug her big sister, and start chatting about dreams or cartoons. Grace packed Lily's lunch into a weathered container while they ate. Afterward, Grace would walk Lily to school. Sometimes they shared a ride on Grace's old bicycle, Lily clinging to her back. Other days they walked hand in hand. Grace always made sure Lily's hair was brushed, her sweater zipped, her shoes tied. No matter how tired Grace felt, Lily always came first. Once Lily was through the school gates, Grace returned home, gave her mother her morning medications, then rested for a few hours before preparing to do it all over again. Their life was modest, but full of quiet love. The apartment held signs of that love everywhere: drawings on the fridge, a chipped mug that read, "One Sister," and the ever-present aroma of homemade broth Grace made to soothe her mother's joints. At the hospital, Grace was known for her quiet competence and warmth. Her blonde hair was always pulled into a neat bun, her scrubs crisp even after sleepless nights. She remembered patients' names and quirks, offered tissues during hard moments, and had a way of calming even the most anxious souls. One afternoon, just a few days after his first real conversation with Grace, Daniel arrived at the hospital earlier than usual. As he passed a small patient lounge, he noticed Grace sitting beside an elderly woman in a wheelchair. The woman was bundled in a shawl, hands frail and curled. Grace held a thermos and a folded napkin. "I made this last night," she said, unscrewing the lid. "Chicken and ginger broth, my mom's recipe. It might help a little." The woman smiled. "If it tastes as good as it smells, I'll want a second helping." Daniel lingered unseen near the door. Grace gently spoon-fed her, chatting about a squirrel that had sneaked into the break room earlier. Then the woman's eyes welled up. "Too hot?" Grace asked softly. The woman shook her head. "No, it's perfect. It tastes just like what my mother used to make. I haven't had that taste in over 10 years. Grace handed her a tissue, her voice warm. "Then I guess our moms had something in common." Daniel quietly stepped away, not wanting to disturb the moment, but the image stayed with him. That evening, he caught Grace outside Alice's room. "I saw you earlier," he said. Grace looked puzzled. "Where?" "With the woman in the lounge," he replied. "The soup? That moment?" She smiled shyly. "She looked like she needed something warm. My mom always says food made with love is the best kind of medicine." Daniel looked at her for a long moment. "That's something I never really knew how to give." Grace tilted her head slightly, then smiled. "It's never too late to learn," she said. And then she walked down the hallway, quiet, steady, unforgettable. Something shifted in Daniel that night, not loudly, but deeply, and it stayed. Daniel found himself returning to the hospital earlier each day, where once he would have spent his evenings buried in meetings or buried in numbers. Now he sat quietly beside his daughter's hospital bed, watching the gentle rise and fall of her chest, listening to the faint beeping of machines, and waiting. He answered fewer emails. He postponed conference calls. He delegated meetings he would never have missed before. For the first time in years, Daniel Wexler, the man who ran his company with military precision, let the world spin without him. Grace remained the same, diligent, composed, softly cheerful in a way that never felt forced. But Daniel started to notice more, the way she always tucked her hair behind her ear before leaning in to speak to a patient, how she adjusted her tone to match each person's need. She didn't just care for people, she connected with them, especially with Alice. Each time Grace entered Alice's room, it was as if the air changed. She never led with medical updates or cold instructions. Instead, she knocked playfully on the doorframe and announced, "Special delivery for one royal patient," or "Permission to enter the castle of Princess Alice." Alice, still weak but alert now, would light up at the sight of her. The little girl's face, pale and tired, would soften into a smile. Grace always crouched down to Alice's level, her voice animated. "So, my lady, today's question is, do we want to be a brave doctor saving lives, or a super cool superhero flying through walls?" Alice giggled every time. "Can I be both?" "You may," Grace replied, "but only if you promise to teach me your secret powers." Their banter became a daily ritual. Grace checked vitals and changed bandages with such ease and gentleness that Alice never winced. Sometimes she brought stickers or drew doodles on medical gloves to entertain her. One afternoon, when her shift allowed, Grace wheeled Alice through the hospital garden. The late sun cast golden rays over the flowers and hedges, and Alice looked around with wide, curious eyes. Daniel followed at a distance, unannounced, unnoticed. He had come early, as usual, and found the room empty, only to see them both through the window, laughing beneath the soft light. He stepped outside just far enough to see but not intrude. Grace bent down at one point and plucked a small yellow flower from the grass. She twirled it between her fingers before handing it to Alice with a conspiratorial whisper. "This is a magic flower," she said, "a super-secret kind. It helps brave girls heal even faster." Alice clutched it tightly in her small hands. "Really?" Grace smiled, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. "Really, really." Daniel watched as Alice hugged the flower to her chest for the rest of the stroll. Her eyes sparkled. Her laugh rang out, light and free. The moment struck him harder than he expected. There was no boardroom in the world, no investment, no partnership, no innovation that could give Alice what that one small flower and the woman who gave it just had. As Grace gently wheeled Alice toward the elevator, Daniel stepped back out of sight. But in his mind the image stayed, of the woman with sunlight in her hair and a child's trust in her eyes. He sat alone in the waiting area for a while, staring at the floor, a strange tightness in his chest. It had been so long since anything had stirred in him that he barely recognized the feeling. And then the thought came, sudden, uninvited, and impossible to ignore. If she were Alice's mother... He did not finish the sentence in his head. He didn't have to. The weight of it pressed against him, warm and dangerous. For a fleeting moment, he allowed the picture to form. Grace sitting beside Alice at the dinner table, helping with homework, humming in the kitchen. A soft presence that filled the silence he had lived in for so long, but just as quickly he shook it off. He scoffed under his breath and leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "No," he muttered. "Don't be ridiculous." She was kind, yes, compassionate, but that did not mean anything was meant to be. He was broken in ways Grace did not deserve to be caught in. Love, for someone like him, was a luxury, one he had long since forfeited. He pushed the thought away, folded it into a quiet corner of his mind. Still, that night, when Alice fell asleep clutching the yellow flower in her hand, Daniel stood by her bedside a little longer than usual, and as he looked down at her peaceful face, he whispered silently into the dark, "Thank you, Grace." It was a quiet Tuesday when Grace asked him. They were standing outside Alice's room. The little girl had just fallen asleep after another cheerful visit from Grace, who had read 2 chapters of a fairy tale in full character voices. Daniel had watched from the corner, arms crossed loosely, his heart quietly unraveling with every giggle from his daughter. As Grace stepped out of the room, brushing her ponytail back over her shoulder, she glanced at him and hesitated. "You've been here almost every evening lately," she said softly. "Have you eaten anything that wasn't from a vending machine?" Daniel gave her a faint smile. "I had coffee, twice." She laughed, shaking her head. "That doesn't count." There was a pause. Then, in a tone that was casual but somehow still nervous, she added, "If you're free tonight, would you want to join me and my family for dinner?" Daniel blinked. "Your family?" "My mom and little sister." "Nothing fancy," she said quickly. "Just a real meal. It might be good for you." He considered declining. He always did. But this time, something in her eyes, gentle, inviting, without pity, made him nod. "Okay," he said. "I'd like that." Later that evening, Daniel followed Grace's car down a quiet street to a modest apartment complex on the outskirts of the city. The building was old but well kept, the kind of place that felt lived in. Warm window lights glowed against the darkening sky. Grace opened the door to a small 2-bedroom apartment that smelled of garlic and herbs. Inside, everything was tidy but clearly loved. Crocheted blankets over the couch, magnets on the fridge, drawings taped to the walls. "Mom, Lily, this is Mr. Wessler," Grace said, stepping aside so he could enter. "Daniel," she corrected herself, glancing at him with a shy smile. Her mother, a woman in her late 50s with kind eyes and stiff hands, greeted him warmly from her spot at the kitchen table. "We've heard a lot about you," she said. Lily, a bright-eyed 10-year-old, peeked from the hallway. "You're Alice's dad?" Daniel smiled, unsure what else to say. Guilty. Dinner was simple: stir-fried vegetables, steamed rice, and a big pot of chicken stew that smelled like someone had taken the concept of comfort and simmered it for hours. The table was small, with 4 mismatched chairs, but somehow it felt like the most welcoming place Daniel had sat in years. They talked about school, about favorite books, about how Lily thought Grace's hospital shoes were the ugliest things on the planet. There was laughter, teasing, and the easy rhythm of a family that had learned to support each other through everything. Daniel didn't speak much. He mostly listened, but he smiled more than he had in a long time. At one point, Grace stood to refill water glasses, and Daniel looked around the table, the dim kitchen light casting a soft glow on the food, on her mother's gentle smile, on Lily giggling over a joke no one really understood. Something tugged at him, something deep and unfamiliar. When Grace returned and sat beside him again, he looked at her, then down at his plate. He hadn't even realized he'd finished everything. Then, quietly, he said, "It's been a long time since I've felt like I was sitting at home." The table grew quiet. Grace's eyes flicked up to his. Her mother smiled, understanding more than he had spoken aloud. "It's nothing special," Grace said softly. "It's everything," Daniel replied. There was a long pause, but it was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence filled with warmth, of things being rebuilt, gently and without force. Later, as he helped clear the dishes despite protests from both women, Lily pressed a small hand-drawn picture into his palm. It was of a stick-figure family. A little girl, her dad, and a blonde woman holding hands. Daniel stared at it for a long time after he got home that night. He did not put it away. He left it on the nightstand beside his bed, and for the first time in years, he slept without dreams of regret, only memories of warmth and the quiet echo of laughter around a kitchen table. Change did not come in a single moment for Daniel. It came quietly, like sunlight creeping across a room in the early hours, soft but undeniable. Little by little, he began to live differently. It started with a single decision: no more late nights. He called his assistant early one morning and said simply, "Block out my calendar after 6, permanently." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Sir?" she asked, confused. "You mean for today?" "No," he said, glancing over at Alice, who was curled up beside him with a picture book. "I mean for good." From then on, every day at 5:30 he left the office, no matter how many emails needed answering, no matter how many deals still needed closing, he walked out the door. He began picking Alice up from school himself. The first time she saw him through the window and squealed so loudly that her teacher turned around in surprise. "Daddy!" she cried, running into his arms. He lifted her high into the air, hugging her so tightly she laughed. It had been so long since he had been there, at the end of a school day. Her small backpack bumped against his chest, and he realized how much he had missed. They made up stories together in the car ride home about cloud kingdoms and tea parties with dragons. He learned that she loved grape jelly but hated strawberry, that her favorite color was now purple, not pink, that she wanted to be a Dr. Princess astronaut when she grew up. Each night, he sat beside her bed and read aloud. At first, he stumbled through the fairy tales, his voice stiff, uncertain. But Alice would giggle and help him out, correcting his pronunciations, filling in words when he lost his place. And slowly the stiffness melted away. One night, after reading about a brave knight who saved a tiny village from a giant, Alice handed him a folded piece of paper. "I made this today," she said. He opened it and felt his throat tighten. It was a drawing. 3 figures, holding hands, a tall man with brown hair and a tie, a little girl in a pink dress, and a blonde woman in scrubs. He looked at her. "Is this us?" he asked. Alice nodded proudly. "That's you, that's me, and that's Nurse Grace. She's my best friend." He swallowed hard, blinking away the sting in his eyes. "It's beautiful," he whispered. He did not know what moved him more, the innocence of her joy or the fact that somehow, in Alice's world, they were already a family. Later that night he sat at his desk, opened his laptop, and typed out a short email. Subject: New Policy 2. Executive Assistant message. No meetings scheduled after 6 p.m. Family time is non-negotiable. Block it across all calendars. He hit send, closed the laptop, and went to tuck Alice in for the night. Grace continued to visit often, now not just as a nurse, but as a friend. She brought Alice new books and sat in during story time occasionally, laughing when Daniel made the wrong animal sound. They started having coffee in the hospital courtyard during Daniel's breaks, talking about life, childhood, grief, and hope. He still had moments of doubt. He still questioned whether he deserved the happiness slowly building around him. But when Alice grabbed his hand as they walked together, or when Grace smiled at him with that quiet, knowing look, he felt something he had not felt in years: peace. He was not just a man trying to fix his past anymore. He was a father becoming someone his daughter could count on. And that, finally, was enough. The hospital never truly slept, but some mornings felt gentler than others, like the world paused briefly before the chaos began. Daniel stood in the courtyard outside the pediatric wing, sipping his coffee as the sun rose. He had just walked Alice into her first outpatient therapy session. She skipped beside him, holding his hand, still clutching the flower Grace had given her, now pressed inside a small plastic case to preserve the spell. His phone buzzed. Board meeting at 9 a.m. He silenced it without hesitation. Through the glass doors, he spotted Grace walking slowly beside an elderly patient, adjusting their IV with quiet care. She smiled, nodded, listened. Always present, always steady. Daniel admired her, though the word felt far too small. Over the weeks, Grace had become more than the nurse who'd comforted him in the dark. She was the anchor that steadied everything. A few days later, he overheard two nurses talking near the break room. "She's not taking extra shifts this week," one said. "Her mom's going in for surgery." "Finally?" the other asked. "I thought they couldn't afford it." "They can't, but it's worse now. Grace will figure something out. She always does." Daniel stood frozen. He said nothing to Grace that evening, only watched as she walked Alice down the hallway, both laughing about something silly. Her ponytail bounced as she moved, exhausted but always full of life. That night, once Alice was asleep, Daniel made a few quiet calls. Grace's mother was scheduled for joint replacement surgery in less than a week. The hospital had offered a payment plan, but it was steep. Insurance barely covered half. The next morning, Daniel paid the remaining balance in full. No name, no recognition. Just an envelope at the front desk, labeled with Grace's name. Inside was the receipt and a small folded note. From someone who once received a jacket on a cold night. That evening, between shifts, Grace was called to the desk. She opened the envelope, confused. Her eyes scanned the receipt, then widened. Her hand shook as she unfolded the note. It took only a second to know who had sent it. She did not cry immediately. She stood there, stunned, as the hospital moved around her, phones ringing, footsteps echoing. But something in her chest opened. The tears came later, quietly, as she sat alone on the same bench outside the ICU where she'd once seen Daniel. She didn't cry because the bill was paid. She cried because someone had seen her struggle and answered it, not out of pity, but with care, with memory. The next day, she found Daniel waiting in the hallway for Alice's test results. When he looked up and saw her, he stood. "You didn't have to," she said gently. "I know," he replied. "I would have figured it out. I know that too, but I also know how it feels to carry everything alone." She held his gaze, a moment full of quiet understanding. Then she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him, just once, just enough. It was not about money. It never had been. It was about being seen, about someone choosing to stand beside you when you had grown used to standing alone. And in that brief, wordless embrace, Daniel understood this was what Grace really looked like. Spring arrived gently, as if the world itself had decided to slow down and breathe again. The trees outside the hospital bloomed with soft pink flowers, and laughter once again echoed through the corridors that had witnessed so many quiet tears. Alice was no longer the pale, silent little girl who clutched a flower like a lifeline. She now ran through the park with a wide grin, her cheeks rosy, arms stretched like airplane wings. She wore a purple jacket and sparkly shoes, and every now and then she would stop to pluck a dandelion and blow the seeds into the wind. She was whole again, happy, healthy. Daniel had made his decision weeks ago. He stepped down from his position as CEO. No press release, no headlines, just a quiet announcement to the board, and then he was gone. He had lived too long chasing numbers and milestones. Now, his milestones were measured in bedtime stories and breakfast pancakes. He poured his energy into a new mission, one that mattered more to him than any company ever had. He founded a nonprofit organization called Home is Love, dedicated to helping single parents reconnect with their children, offering parenting workshops, emotional support, and storytelling programs in hospitals and shelters across the city. The first donation came from Daniel himself, the second from Grace. Their relationship had evolved naturally, no dramatic declarations, no rushed confessions, just shared moments, smiles across hospital corridors, morning coffees, Saturday afternoons in the park with Alice, flying kites and blowing bubbles. It was not fast, but it was real. They saw each other's brokenness and chose each other anyway. Daniel learned how to braid Alice's hair. Grace taught him how to make her favorite grilled cheese. He, in turn, showed Grace how to ride a bicycle again, something she had not done since she was 12. Their worlds slowly wove together. One sunny Sunday, the three of them sat beneath a tree in the park. Alice was coloring on a small sketch pad while Grace read a book beside her. Daniel was lying back, eyes half closed, hands resting behind his head. Out of nowhere, Alice looked up and asked, "Daddy, can Nurse Grace be my new mommy?" The question was so sincere, so innocent, that both adults froze for a second. Grace's eyes widened. Daniel sat up, blinking. Alice looked at them, waiting. Then Daniel laughed, a warm, surprised laugh that shook him to his core. Grace laughed too, blushing, a little breathless. Daniel looked at Grace and for the first time did not turn away from the thought that had once scared him. "I think," he said softly, meeting Grace's eyes, "that's a wonderful question." Grace looked at him, eyes shining with unshed tears, and smiled. Nothing else needed to be said. Some days later, as the sun dipped low in the sky, they returned to the hospital courtyard, the place where it had all begun. The benches were still there. The same breeze rustled the leaves, the same flowers, now freshly bloomed, lined the path. Daniel walked up quietly behind Grace, who stood by the bench, looking out over the garden. He gently placed a jacket, his, over her shoulders. She turned slowly, eyes meeting his. "The blonde nurse," he whispered with a smile. "Thank you for saving my life, not just once." Her eyes glistened, but she didn't cry. She just reached up and rested her hand over his. "And this time," she said, voice soft and full, "you showed up right on time." Just then, a familiar laugh rang out. Alice, in her favorite dress, came running down the path. "Come on, slowpokes," she shouted, grabbing their hands. And so in the golden light of a late afternoon, they walked hand in hand, father, daughter, and the woman who had helped rebuild their world. Together, whole, home. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey of love, healing, and second chances. If this story touched your heart, reminded you of the beauty in small acts of kindness, or gave you hope that even the most broken moments can lead to something whole, then you're exactly where you need to be. We believe in the power of storytelling to heal, to connect, and to inspire. Every week we bring you real and heartfelt tales that remind us what truly matters: family, compassion, and the quiet strength of the human spirit. If you felt something today, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a story that could touch your soul, because sometimes one story is all it takes to change a life, maybe even your own. Thank you for watching. See you in the next story.